Welcome to Get Sleepy, the podcast where we listen, we relax, and we get sleepy. I'm your host, Thomas. Thanks so much for tuning in. Tonight, I'll be reading an incredibly sweet tale of two friends and their special connection with the woods near their homes. Spending time in nature not only stirs the imagination and the senses, but can also really increase our feelings of happiness. And the woodland in this story is no exception. We'll discover the secret behind its magical, joyous atmosphere. So, let's settle down now and prepare for a good night's sleep. However you're feeling right now, and no matter what's going on in your life at the moment, you're completely deserving of a chance to rest. We all have responsibilities, and we all tend to be burdened by thoughts and worries at times. But be in no doubt that this moment right here is your time to let all of that fade and simply relax. Gently slow your breathing, finding a pace that induces a sense of calm. Draw the air in and let any tension come together at the shoulders. Then steadily release the breath and visualize that tension rolling down through your body, all the way out through the tips of your toes. Breathe in, collect the tension, and let it all go with the exhale. Now, it's time for our story. The setting is a tranquil woodland. Strong and wise ancient trees cover the forest floor. Birds chirp cheerfully, and other animals scutter around, building nests and finding food. And colourful butterflies flutter in the warm light of the sun. There is the comforting smell of leaves, grass, and flowers, all mingled together. This woodland is a very special place, and it's where our story begins. Once upon a time, there was an ancient woodland. It was located in a remote valley deep in the hills, and known only to the two families farming the land around it. The few people who knew of the wood's existence called it the Dell. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything special. While walking through the Dell, a visitor would see all the usual woodland sights. They'd come across plenty of tall, green-leaved trees like ash, beech, and silver birch, and a profusion of colourful wildflowers. There were also rabbits, squirrels, and the occasional fox or badger. Nothing out of the ordinary, a visitor might think. But slowly, subtly, the Dell would work its magic. After spending some time amongst the trees, the visitor would notice a change in their mood. They would feel lighter, happier. Every tree, bush, and flower seemed to radiate joy. The visitor could feel this warm energy folding around them like a gentle, soft mantle. The happiness was all around, permeating the air. It could be smelled, tasted, breathed in. Because of its remote location, visitors to the Dell were very few and far between. Experiencing the woodland's magical atmosphere was a privilege for the lucky few, like the families who lived nearby. Their houses were situated on the edge of the woodland. They lived in traditional, adjoining farm cottages, just a field and a half away from the Dell. These families had lived in the area and worked on the land for generations. Everyone felt a deep connection to the nature that surrounded them. In their everyday conversations, they would often remark on the creatures they'd noticed scampering about. From deer to rabbits, hares, owls, foxes, and badgers. The families loved to catch glimpses of all the animals and birds going about their business. It was a feast for the eyes, a constant source of pleasure and entertainment. And likewise, the woodland creatures enjoyed their own view of the farms and the human inhabitants. The families and their cottages had been there for so long that they had almost become part of the natural landscape. The pigeons and sparrows would often perch on the cottage rooftops. The rabbits, foxes, and deer would linger in the nearby field, just beyond the garden gate. It became almost like a game to them. They would try to catch a glimpse of the people who lived inside, without being spotted themselves. Inside these farmhouses, the two families lived and worked in happy harmony with each other. The children were all of similar ages, so they grew up together. Two of them in particular became inseparable, Lucy and Amelia. Although they were neighbours, they had developed such a strong friendship over the years that they were more like sisters. The two girls were now teenagers, fun-loving, curious, and full of life. Lucy and Amelia loved to laugh and talk deeply about their loves and fears, their opinions and dreams. Their happiness was infectious. Wherever they went, they brought laughter and joy, brightening the atmosphere. After school or on the weekends, Lucy and Amelia would spend hours walking in the Dell. This was where they felt happiest, exploring the winding trails of the woods or watching the birds and the animals. In the summer, they would often bring a picnic and spend all day in the woods, chatting about anything and everything. One warm summer's day, Lucy and Amelia were both feeling tired. The school term had just come to an end, and the holidays had finally begun. The girls were in need of a change and a rest. And while they were tempted to stay at home and sleep all afternoon, they knew that spending time in nature would do them good. In its own way, it could be just as restful as sleep. After reassuring their parents they would be back long before dark, Lucy and Amelia packed their picnic bag and set off for the Dell. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon. Birds sang and soared through the cloudless blue sky above, and the woodland was bursting with life. It seemed as though every flower was blooming, and every bush and tree was laden with fruit. All the animals were out too. When the girls entered the Dell, they caught sight of some squirrels, a hare, and even a woodpecker drilling away at a nearby tree trunk. Although many of these creatures were shy by nature, they were not afraid of the girls. In fact, they appeared almost happy to see them. The squirrels scampered around their feet, while the hare paused in the grass and watched on curiously. The girls felt as though they were receiving a warm, silent welcome. As they walked on through the woodland, Lucy and Amelia could feel all their stress and tiredness melt away. These peaceful woods were so familiar that being here felt like coming home. With every step, their mood lifted. For a while, the girls walked in silence to appreciate the sounds of the Dell. Listening carefully, they could hear the distinctive, lyrical hammering of the woodpecker echoing through the trees. Then there was the crackling of dried vegetation underfoot and melodic birdsong. Sometimes the woodland seemed to have its very own language, with the trees whispering in the wind. In other moments, it was more like music than words, a symphony of pure sound. Lucy and Amelia crossed a narrow grassy bank, then passed through a corridor of trees. The leafy branches stretched to create an archway, forming a welcoming entrance to the deepest part of the woods. At last, the girls reached their favorite place, a shady spot under the branches of an ancient oak tree. In the shade of the oak, Lucy spread out the picnic blanket, while Amelia poured out the glasses of elderflower cordial. Then they sat down to drink, rest, and talk for hours. Here, in the heart of the Dell, they felt happy and free. They loved the privacy of the woods, where there was no one to eavesdrop or interrupt. But the girls were not entirely alone. The woodland creatures continued to watch them, peeking through the grass or peering down from the branches of nearby trees. As the girls talked, laughed, and shared their deepest confidences, pure happiness floated high into the air. For humans, this was a happiness that could only be sensed, not seen. But for the animals of the Dell, it was a tangible, visible substance. The aura of happiness radiated from the girls, taking the form of a misty golden cloud. It spread through the air around them and left glittering trails wherever they walked and on everything they touched. This was one of the reasons why the creatures of the Dell felt such a close connection with the girls and their families. The presence of the humans had been so positive, bringing joy to the woodland. The energy of the girls was particularly powerful. They left traces of happiness everywhere. As they grew older and their friendship grew closer, their influence on the forest became even stronger. Lucy and Amelia were completely unaware of the effect they had on their surroundings. They only knew that they were happy, and the cause of this happiness was the company of the other person, as well as the peaceful atmosphere of the woods. All afternoon, the animals continued to watch the girls from afar. They never got too close, as they didn't want to disturb their conversation. When they were left alone like this, talking and joking, golden clouds of joy spiraled through the air, right up to the tallest branches of the trees. As they watched, the birds and animals chatted happily amongst each other, sending signals throughout the forest. The Dell had its own messaging system. For instance, when a hare picked up on the vibrations of someone's footsteps, it would quickly pass on the news to the other animals. The woodpeckers also had a special code, tapping out messages on the tree trunks. In this way, all the creatures in the woodland were made aware of any visitors. From the hedgehogs in the undergrowth to the birds in the treetops, everyone was connected with each other. They could communicate quickly and easily as messages were passed from one end of the dell to the other. This network was also used to alert the long-eared owls. At this time of day, they were usually still dozing in their nests. But on the other side of the dell, two wise old owls were just beginning to stir. They'd heard the woodpecker's message echoing through the trees and knew exactly what it meant. As they woke up and stretched their wings, the owls hooted happily. A visit from the girls was always cause for celebration, and once they'd left the dell, there was work to be done. Meanwhile, Lucy and Amelia were slowly getting ready to leave. They'd spent a wonderful afternoon together, but they decided they should get home in good time before the light faded, just as they'd promised their parents. So, retracing their steps, they said their goodbyes to the woodland and all its inhabitants. By the time they emerged from the dell, the sun was slowly sinking on the horizon. Across the field, they could see the silhouettes of the two farms. In the golden light of the setting sun, the edges of the houses seemed to be glowing with their own illumination. And then, one by one, the windows in the houses began to light up. As they got closer, more details gradually became visible. In one house, they could see someone in the kitchen window. It was probably Lucy's father, preparing something delicious for dinner. In the other house, Amelia's sister was moving from room to room, closing the curtains. She waved when she caught sight of the girls approaching. At the farmhouse gate, Lucy and Amelia hugged each other goodbye. It had been a beautiful day, but they were both feeling hungry now and a little tired. They were looking forward to having dinner with their families, then a bath and an early night. As the two girls returned home, the birds and animals of the dell also went back to their own nests and dens for the night. They too were ready for a long, peaceful sleep. Darkness fell on the woodland. The moon threw its beams of warm yellow light through the trees and across the fields. The stars twinkled against a black velvet night sky, casting their silver glow across the woods. All was still, except for two long-eared owls who set about their work. First, they flew over to a nearby tree branch, which is where they kept a magical bag. This finely woven bag was made of silvery spider webs. The material was extremely delicate. It was so delicate, in fact, that it could not be used to carry any solid object. Even the smallest, lightest pebble would have been too heavy for the fragile thread. But the owl's bag had been designed for another purpose. The two owls carried the bag between them, hanging from their talons, and then took flight. They flew through the moonlit woods, searching for the route that the girls had taken earlier that day. Thanks to the woodpecker's message, they knew just where to look. As they soared through the trees, the owls used their powerful night vision to scan the ground below. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for. The silver moonbeams illuminated everything, from the branches of the trees to the shadowy outlines of the plants and flowers. The moon also cast light on a magical golden substance which lined the woodland trails. This was the aura of happiness that the girls had left behind. It wound through the pathways of the Dell and floated around the trunk of the ancient oak tree where the girls had sat. Here, the misty aura was so intense that it looked as though the oak was floating, suspended by a shining cloud. The owls hooted in triumph. This was what they'd been searching for. Whenever the girls came to the Dell, they brought their happiness with them, and they also left it behind. Here it was, scattered throughout the woodland, on the grass and around the oak. They'd even left glittering traces on the plants they'd touched. The tips of the lavender now glowed gold, like all the other scented herbs and flowers that the girls had brushed their fingers through. The owls nodded at each other, then swooped down towards the trail. With their synchronized maneuvers, the owls put on a spectacular aerobatic display. They flew in parallel lines, with the woven web stretched wide, catching the golden aura of happiness. From the cloud by the oak tree to the faint traces on the petals, the owls made sure to capture it all. Every shining speck of happiness was collected in their silvery woven mesh. Once they had gathered everything, the owls carefully folded the sparkling web. It was bulging now, completely filled with pure, joyful emotion. The owls were delighted with their catch. While the girls and their families often brought happiness to the forest, this was the most they'd ever collected. Now that the bag was full, it was time for the owls to carry out the final stage of their night's work. Still carrying the bag between them, The owls flew higher and higher above the canopy. Up and up they went, as though they were flying all the way to the moon. At last, they stopped to hover mid-air and looked at the moonlit landscape beneath them. From here, they could see everything: all the treetops of the Dell, the surrounding fields, and the 2 farmhouses. The families were fast asleep, and so was the rest of the world, it seemed. All was silent. Nothing stirred but the wings of the owls fluttering in the night sky. After nodding to each other once more, the owls began their final flight of the evening. They soared over the woodlands and farms, emptying the contents of the bag of happiness over everything and everyone below. In this way, the joy that the girls had brought to the Dell would be spread all around. It was no longer confined to the route they'd walked. Instead, the happiness was shared far and wide, all through the woods, the valley, and the hills. The magical emotion always lingered more intensely at the point of origin. This is why the Dell had such a uniquely joyful atmosphere. Lucy and Amelia had spent so many happy moments in the woodland that it had left a permanent mark and could be sensed by others. But thanks to the flight of the owls, the happiness was spread further throughout the countryside. As the owls circled round and round, the golden aura descended on the sleeping inhabitants of the Dell and its surroundings. Everyone felt it. The birds and animals, and of course, the families in the 2 farmhouses. As the shower of light fell upon the roofs, Lucy and Amelia absorbed it all and smiled in their sleep. Little did they know that they were not just the recipients of the happiness, but also the cause. It was a beautiful cycle that would be repeated day after day, night after night. All living creatures could share it with one another. The next morning, they would all awake, full of hope and joy. But for now, they slept deeply and peacefully under the magical influence of their shared happiness.